Good evening to all of you. If you don't know who I am, I'm Sukant Misra. I'm Vice Provost for International Affairs here at Texas Tech University. Uh, as we have done in the past, we are honored to have among us a panel of four distinguished former high ranking U.S. diplomats representing the American Academy of Diplomacy. This year's Ambassadors Forum provides the opportunity to engage in dialogue foreign perceptions of the US in the post COVID world. What is reality? What is myth? And does it matter? We welcome the ambassadors to our virtual platform and encourage members of the community to take part in the discussion about a generational crisis that disrupted our lives as we knew it, and no doubt will reshape it forever. Before we get started, let me remind you that this is our sixth year of hosting the Ambassadors Forum. We were able to introduce to our community this intellectually stimulating event because of a generous financial support from the Center for Global Understanding for 3 years in a row, starting 2016. And for the last couple of years, we have been able to continue with this signature event with support from TTU's College of Engineering, Arts and Sciences, Honors College, College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, and the B.L. Allen Endowment in Pedology. Now, without further delay, I introduce to you the moderator of today's forum, Ambassador Ron Neumann, the current president of the board of the American Academy of Diplomacy, former deputy secretary, assistant secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, and former ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. His lifelong dedication and service to America's international relations and affairs was currently celebrated with American Foreign Service Association's award for lifetime contributions to American diplomacy. Ambassador Newman.
Well, Dr. Misra, it's a pleasure to be back, sort of back with you in Lubbock. I wish we were back all the way, but at least we are able to continue our tradition of bringing the forum. And of course, in past years, this particular event that we're at now would have been a congenial event around the dinner tables in your center, but we'll do the best we can. So, for those who haven't been with us the last few years, just a brief background note. When we started this, we did more or less conventional panels where we had a subject. And then we got to thinking, Dr. Misfer got us to thinking that, we always start and say we want to hear what people have to say, and then we use up all the time with the panelists, and there's 15 minutes at the end, and somebody gets a question. And so we said, well, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do a panel where we can take questions, where we've got a lot more time for people. And it seemed a little bit strange when we started, but it seemed to go down well. People seemed to like it. And so we've again adopted that approach this year. I've brought three colleagues with very deep experience, and between the three, very broad experience, so we can handle most of your questions. Might have to fake it otherwise, but we can probably handle most of them. And what we're going to do to start off with is we're going to give you a little bit, each one of us is going to give you a little bit of a bio note to kind of set in for you where we are, where our areas of expertise or experience are, that you could focus your questions. And just a little bit, tiny squib, to give you a sense of some different aspects of diplomacy. And so I'm going to actually sweep up after the other three. So I'm going to let Ambassador Thomas start with a bit of bio of his career, and also to give you a sense of one aspect of an embassy, what it is like to direct an embassy that has uh, almost every federal agency involved. Many people don't realize, I think, that in many cases, the State Department officers are actually the minority in many embassies, that the embassy is a platform for every aspect of the US government that works overseas. And Ambassador Thomas can tell you that that's more numerous than you might think. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Newman, and good evening, Texas Tech. Dr. Mistra, Dr. Goodman, thank you for having us here today. We've enjoyed it. I'm a native of New York City, now transplanted to Florida. I'm a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross and Columbia University. I'm now a senior fellow at Yale, and I work in Special Operations Command. I was honored to serve our nation, and you notice that all of us will be saying we served our nation. As ambassador to Bangladesh, Philippines, and Zimbabwe, Director General of the Foreign Service, Executive Secretary of the Department, and Staff Officer for South Asia of the National Security Council. I will focus on a little bit on the Philippines. Our embassy in the Philippines had over 30 sections, including Voice of America. We had a 600-acre plot 60 miles away where we had Voice of America. We had to keep it running. We also had to fend off the New People's Army, who were terrorists trying to take over Voice of America. That was one aspect. We had 700 special operations commanders in the South training Filipinos against terrorists. That was another aspect, coordinating that. We had USAID, the Agency for International Development, who had to work very closely with the Special Operations Command, because Special Operations Command could periodically check their development projects to see if they were working, because it was too dangerous for AID to go there. So I say that to say our embassies are varied and large, with many interests from Washington, and we do what we do to serve the American people.
Thank you. Great start. Ambassador Greenwood, you've had a very different kind of career. And so if you would talk a little bit about how you got here with your career, and then if you would also speak a little bit about the business of making trade negotiations work from the field perspective, which I think very few people have any sense of.
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador Newman. My name is Larry Greenwood. I was a Foreign Service officer for 30 years, from 1976 to 2006. I was an economic officer, so I did almost all my work in the economic field, working in particular on trade policy and trade agreements, foreign investment, and development finance. Geographically, I spent most of my overseas postings in Asia. I was twice in Japan, and that's my kind of specialty, I guess. I speak Japanese. I also served in Southeast Asia, in Singapore and the Philippines. I was ambassador to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, which is a multilateral organization that looks at how to promote economic development and integration in the Asia Pacific region. After retiring in 2006, I went to the Asian Development Bank, where I was one of the deputies in charge of running the bank. That's based in the Philippines. It's a multilateral development bank that lends money to countries, developing countries in Asia, to help them grow and eliminate poverty. Then I worked for MetLife Insurance up in Japan as a government relations person, helping them set up a new operation in Japan. And then settled in San Francisco to be I ran the Japan Society of Northern California, a small nonprofit. And I currently also work as a consultant for a DC-based company. I spent a lot of my career working in the field, trying to create more market opportunities for American companies and American workers to help grow, obviously, the jobs back here in the United States. And a lot of that was in Japan. And it's a job that's mainly about, frankly, in a way, it's a lobbying job, not that different from lobbying in Austin or lobbying in DC. You have to know kind of who are the decision makers, what the rules are, regulations, who cares about the rules, who wants to change the rules, who wants to keep them, and then work behind the scenes to get allies so that you can change those rules. And in the cases I worked on, change the rules so that U.S. companies would have a better ability to compete in the market and get more market share. And so it involved, again, being very much on the ground, knowing the language, knowing the people involved, talking to all different kinds of people. I've talked to business CEOs and Yakuza gangsters in pursuit of American commercial interests overseas. It was a job I very much enjoyed, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I'm gonna do one follow-up question, which I haven't been doing this, but I gotta find out, Larry, why did you have to talk? I can't hold it any longer. Why did you have to talk to gangsters, and how did that further American interest?
Because we were trying to get U.S. shipping lines to be able to freely use Japanese ports, and they were not allowed to run their berthing, their areas. They had to get advance notice, and it was very difficult for them to actually use it. So use Japanese ports. So in fact, most American companies were going to Korea, offloading their cargo there, and then sending small ships to Japan. Obviously, they couldn't compete doing that. So we had to open up the ports. The ports were controlled by stevedore unions, who were in turn controlled by, guess who? The Yakuza. And so it's very much on the waterfront type of territory, except this was the late 1990s. So that's the story. And I learned new kinds of vocabulary in Japanese language that had not been taught by the State Department. They don't teach us to talk to Yakuza, and it's a very different language they use.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I used to go up and have breakfast in Pagman with one Afghan warlord who was accused of various war crimes, but we needed him to move along some of the things that the Afghan government needed to make peace. So I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Jimmy Kolker, who has had a kind of bifurcated career between Africa and various aspects of pandemic and health. And so, Jim, if I could ask you both to fill in on the background, it gives people a sense that we're quite a different bunch of folk, but also talk maybe a little bit about some of the sort of peacemaking, peacekeeping work you got into in Uganda.
Sure. I'm Jimmy Kolker. I was born and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I started in the Foreign Service in 1977 and had 3 early posts in Africa, in Southern Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, and then 3 in Northern Europe, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and Denmark. I then got to be ambassador twice, first to Burkina Faso in West Africa, and then Uganda and East Africa. And I'll get back to Uganda in a minute, but I was very influenced there by the fight against AIDS, where Uganda was the epicenter, and President Bush started the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And I left Uganda and became the deputy head of that program, PEPFAR AIDS program, and then retired from state, went to the United Nations as head of AIDS at UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund in New York, and retired there and came back as an Obama appointee in the US Department of Health and Human Services, the first Foreign Service person to have a senior position in HHS. And there I was responsible for, among other things, a lot of the diplomacy having to do with the Ebola response and US relations with the World Health Organization, both of which have been important to the last year's work on outbreaks and the COVID response. In Uganda, as I say, it was the epicenter for AIDS, and that was a huge part of the problem. And our responsibility under PEPFAR was to scale up to try to reach everyone who needed treatment. And that was the challenge in Uganda, because about 1/3 of the country was in a civil war with the Lord's Resistance Army kidnapping kids from school and actually displacing over 1 million people in northern Uganda. And at the same time, the Ugandan government forces were in eastern Congo, supporting and actually fighting with militias who were trying to control commerce there and prolonging that civil war in an area that had been unstable for a generation. And we were, even though we were trying to get the Ugandans to stop their military engagement and abuse of human rights using the military in Congo, and to take a more rational approach to how to bring peace to northern Uganda, we were trying to get them to become the core of the African peacekeeping force in Somalia. So we had a very complicated relationship on the security side. And then at the same time, the president was attempting successfully to amend the Constitution to be able to overturn the 2-term limit, and he's just been reelected for a 5th term. So there were a lot of conflicting areas of cooperation and areas of potential disagreement with Uganda when I was there, and it's kind of typical of many embassies in the world that it's not an easy narrative to say, well, we're here for this purpose, and this is what we're going to achieve.
Thank you. Well, let me do my bit as well. I grew up in California, although my father was a university professor, so I lived a couple of times in France when he was teaching. I joined the Foreign Service after having had a break between my college and my Foreign Service exam and actually entering the Foreign Service. I got carried away and went off to the infantry and Vietnam War and came back from there. Most of my career was spent in the Middle East. I hadn't really planned that. When I was growing up, I planned to go in the Foreign Service, but I hadn't especially focused on the Middle East. And then my father ended up becoming ambassador in Afghanistan, had a break between college and the Army. And my wife and I went to Afghanistan for 3.5 months and roamed all over what was then a perfectly peaceful country by jeep and horse and yak. And I just fell in love with the complexities of the Muslim world. And that sort of dominated the rest of my career, which was very centered on the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, with service in various places that we can't go back to now, right now, Iran, Yemen, later on Iraq. I was ambassador in Algeria during a rather difficult period there when there was a insurgency going on, fairly quiet time in Bahrain. And then went to Iraq and then was asked to go to Afghanistan. And what I wanted to talk about just for a minute is this whole business of risk in the diplomatic world, because diplomats are not soldiers, but in fact, the work involves risk. And it involves risk because it's important for us not just to talk to host governments, but to opposition leaders, to human rights activists, workers, all kinds of people, so that we understand what's going on in the country, so that we can persuade people as much as possible. And it is essential to trying to convince people to do things the way we would like to do them, which is a central part of why you're abroad at all. As a diplomat, you're not there to be another kind of journalist, although you do that, or to be an academic, although it is intellectually challenging, but ultimately to get foreign governments to do what you want. That means you have to get out and talk to people. And nowadays, in certain countries, that involves risk. And in the post-Benghazi period, we have seen our diplomats more and more restricted to working in fortified embassies. And so one project of my day job at the American Academy of Diplomacy is pushing for changes both in practice and in law that will get diplomats back out on the streets more often, understanding that that is going to require tolerating more risk, not stupidly, but understanding that our first job is not security. Our first job is to accomplish the nation's purposes. And to do that, we may have to take some risk, which we have to weigh against how we protect ourselves. So it's a complex question, but it's a reminder that this is not just a job of polished silver and cocktail parties, although we get some of that too. And sometimes the contrast is a little strange. I'll just finish with a little story. I remember in Algeria, almost split vision. a dinner party at the British Ambassadors with a visiting delegation, all polished wood and silver and all the things you would expect. And then stepping through his front door, and the entire inner courtyard of his house was a mass of armored vehicles and security elements marshaling their various convoys to get us all home safely. And the contrast between one side of the door and the other was pretty extreme. So that's just a little vignette of the diplomatic life. So I have a question from Dr. Misra, and this is one that I think really, all of us will want to chime in. Perhaps President Biden has told the world America is back. We're back in the climate agreement. We're back in the UN Human Rights Council. We're back in WHO. The world, though, has shown a certain reluctance to take us seriously because of our track record leaving, rejoining. And the question is, what should we do to gain back America's reliability and credibility? And I think, if I may, because of particularly the health aspects, I'm going to start with Ambassador Culker, but everybody can have a brief go at this.
Well, thanks. And it's good to be part of the discussion. I think we gain back reliability and credibility by being reliable and credible. And the sense that we're in the room, we're at the table, we're listening to other people. And we see organizations multilaterally, certainly the World Health Organization, but also other parts of the UN system, NATO, the various multilateral organizations that are dealing with specific topics. We see them as a multiplier of US influence. And as we have positions in the world and as we have goals that we want to seek, we can see these as competitors, but I think historically they've been much more likely to be reinforcers of US interests. We want a rules-based and evidence-based kind of world order, that these multilateral organizations are very much allies in that, and we can use them to leverage other governments, non-government organizations to kind of set standards and to provide guidance and norms that on human rights, but certainly in the health area, on public health standards and approach to outbreaks and diseases, which the US can't do alone, but neither can the World Health Organization. We need each other. The US has so much expertise, investment in biomedical research, industrial and commercial capacity, that as we saw over the past year, the world without the United States at the table is not able to manufacture and distribute vaccines, is not able to mount its best efforts to control an outbreak. But the United States also alone, if we try to do this on a one country basis, we clearly are not going to be able to control the epidemic or to prevent future threats to the US security and economy because of outbreaks or because of the many other crises that are going on in the world.
Okay, I think this involves all of us to one aspect or another. Larry, negotiating trade agreements when we go in and almost have them and then go out or then change them.
Well, clearly we have a credibility issue and a reliability issue on the trade side. I think having a different tone of discussion obviously is a good thing. But I think at this stage where other countries are going to be looking for action rather than just tone. And so I think the kinds of actions they're going to be looking for on the trade side are what are we going to do with our existing tariffs? We've gone from being one of the most open economies in terms of trade in the OECD to one of the most closed in just 4 years. It's been a very remarkable journey. And a lot of countries like Japan, Canada, Germany are the target of those that are still in place, like the steel tariffs. And so what the new administration does with that will be important. Frankly, getting rid of them would be a good signal, particularly in most cases, they aren't even really effective in the sense of protecting American industry because the Trump administration waived most of them on a per application basis by company. Another example would be climate. So a very effective and ambitious climate change plan to show that in addition to rejoining Paris, that we actually are serious about reducing CO2. And so those are the kinds of, I mean, we're going to need to look for actions as opposed to, and normally we would probably wait and try to negotiate those kinds of things. But I think in some cases, I think it'd be a good sign to actually make some unilateral steps to show that we're back and that we're going to be credible partners.
Thank you. You know, I want to just make one brief comment and then pass it to Ambassador Thomas, and that is that words and actions are going to have to come together. So, you know, the question is, how do we demonstrate credibility? Well, there's two pieces. One, of course, is when you change administrations again, where we go in veer off in another direction. Not much you can do about that at this point. But the other is whether your actions in various forums, as Ambassador Greenwood was talking about, and what we ourselves do in climate change, will back up what we say in forum. And that's, I think, a common human sort of thing, that if your actions and your words go together, people tend to believe you after a while. And if they don't, they don't. Ambassador Thomas, comments?
I think those are all excellent summations. I wholeheartedly agree with them. I would just say that we need to educate the American people on the benefits of what our work has done. That, as Ambassador Greenwood said earlier, we bring jobs to Texas. We bring students to Texas. We bring scholars to Texas. We bring business opportunities. Texans also get to travel for business opportunities. So those things your government, our government has been doing, and to me, it has greatly benefited us. This is not that we are doing this just to help poor and developed countries, although we have to do that and we should. We are doing these things to help the United States and increase our prosperity. And we need to let you know all of these things that we have been doing to make your lives better.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions. We'll get as many as we can in.
Mr. Newman, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Sure, certainly.
Yeah, I wanted to just take a minute to introduce to you our Dean of College of Engineering, Dr. Al Sacco Jr. Dr. Sacco has been a great supporter of the Ambassadors Forum. From the very beginning when we started this, his college has been sponsoring the event on a regular basis. Dr. Sacco, thank you very much for your support. I have given you talking permission if you want to speak for a minute. Al, you're still, let me unmute. Al, you may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
Good.
The Dean of Engineering ought to be able to figure that out, right? But we're all learning new things these days, but it is a pleasure, and it's nice to see you again, Ron. I wish I could entertain you here like we usually do. I think we're a big sponsor of the dinner. We really love that. And, you know, we require all our kids to go abroad in engineering. So it's very important that they get your insight into what it is and what they're going to face and what they see when they come back. And I will say that our kids are great representatives of America. There's a twisted way of America is. It's usually formed by television program and news feeds. But when they get to meet the real thing, it's a big difference for us. And it makes a big, big difference worldwide. And I will tell you, one of the big successes of our program is the fact that they continue those relationships and frequently go back to not only the country they went to when they spent their 8 to 10 to 12 weeks or a year, but they go back frequently afterwards to the surrounding countries. And I think that's the best way for people to get to know each other, when they really, people-to-people contact is so critical, I think, in the world today. And just one quick question. Do you think the pandemic, as bad as it is a tool for our diplomats to try to work through distribution of drugs and trying to get our scientific knowledge to help the world? because I think it can be as bad as it is, it can also be a uniting force because it's a common enemy that the globe faces. So I was wondering what you think of that.
Well, I know Rahm Emanuel has always taken that position that no good crisis should be wasted. I'm going to particularly pass that, I think, to Jimmy Kolker because he's got so much experience in this area. But also, if you would fold into that an answer to another question we've had, which is any U.S. plans for providing COVID-19 vaccines to the underdeveloped world?
Right. It absolutely is the right thing to do, and it's necessary both for public health reasons to get the epidemic under control, and because morally we can't be in the position that only Americans are entitled to protection against a threat like COVID-19. The devil is always in the details, however. I think the administration and the previous administration rightly accelerated the development of vaccines and relied on US manufacture, heavily subsidized in public-private partnerships by the US government in exchange for getting priority access to those vaccines for our own population. And we're in a position now that we are the leading donor to a system called COVAX, which is the World Health Organization, Global Vaccine Alliance, and Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation organization to distribute vaccines internationally. We're the leading donor, but we have not, in fact, donated any vaccines. We have options for contracts for and firm options for 1 billion doses of vaccine. So we could vaccinate every adult American twice with the vaccines for which we've already contracted. But some of those may not be approved in the end. Some of them, there may be reasons that because of variants that those aren't going to be optimal for us. And so we have not been willing to share those extra doses on order, even looking toward the future and future months with any other countries. And so the number of people, for instance, in Africa, in poor countries around the world, in Latin America, are far behind the numbers that in the US and Europe have been able to take advantage of vaccines. And so the sense of, are we obliged to do this and is it the right thing to do? Absolutely. What are the mechanisms by which we make this happen while at the same time protecting the US, which is a hotspot, which absolutely needs quick vaccine protection? We don't have all the answers to those questions, and I hope that your students do, because the people who have been working on it are still behind the curve, and there's a lot left to be done, a lot of decisions that have not been made that will need to be made over the coming months.
I'm going to go on with a question for
If I
Ambassador.
could just jump in just to make one point about I think it's really remarkable how the kind of global cooperation and collaboration that's taken place to even have a vaccine at this point in time. I mean, one thing to note is that this is a great problem to have, right? In the past, the idea of having a vaccine this quickly was unthinkable. And that's because, and the question is a good one, because of unprecedented collaboration around the world of researchers and companies who brought it all to fruition very, very quickly. So harnessing that network of researchers and the private sector has been really important to that success. And I think looking back, that's going to be one of the lessons we draw, is how can we be more purposeful about that collaboration.
Larry, I'm just going to ask you to continue because we've got a question here that asks about prospects of a trade war with China, or ending a trade war with China. I don't know whether you consider we have a full-scale one or only a half of one. Do you see any quick solutions out there?
No. How about that for a quick answer? So no, there's not going to be a quick solution to the U.S.-China trade conflict. Mainly because we have national interests that are diverging. I think eventually we'll find a way to accommodate each other, and we as the kind of the existing power and they as the emerging power. That kind of conflict was almost inevitable, and so I think we're just seeing more of that. I think you'll see a change of policy in the Biden administration on how we carry out our trade policy vis-a-vis China, but not in the amount of in how robust it will be. It will continue to be a robust policy vis-a-vis China. It's not going to be We're going to be looking for ways of making sure that they are trying to shape them and play a role that's more constructive internationally, both in the trade system as well as in finance. And so I think that will be, of course, resisted by China. So I'm hoping we can have a cooler, a cooler discussion of the issues. And I think we will, but we're not going to have a resolution of this conflict for quite some time.
I have an interesting question that we're all going to have a crack at. And it said, if you are to go back to be ambassador to some, and you could pick one of the countries or posts that you were stationed in, now that our country, the United States, is so polarized, how can you convince the country to be more understanding of the democratic system? Now, of course, some of them were democratic to begin with, so we'll rule them out for the answer. But Harry, you want to take a crack at that one first?
Yes, I would, if I had an opportunity to go back, I would go back to Bangladesh. Everybody loves their first posting as ambassador, but the reality is it's a fragile democracy, highly corrupt, but with a population that wants democracy and is polarized as the United States is. And they've been polarized since their independence and coups. So I would be looking in a mirror. How are we going to get them to be less corrupt? How are we going to get them to have accept elections that they win or lose? How are we going to get them to develop their education system? And because they're wonderful in software, but their English skills are not as what you see in Pakistan and India among the computer folks. So it would be looking at a mirror and wondering how we can do it. And I'd probably ask for funding to bring Sesame Street back like we did, which worked there in 26 countries with local birds, local parrots, local people that fit their culture. It would be a major challenge. It would not be solved in the 3 years that I would be given an opportunity to, but I think I could make some progress.
Jimmy, you want to have a crack at that one?
Sure. I may be notorious in that both posts, while I was ambassador, the president got the parliament in both Burkina Faso and Uganda to amend the constitution to eliminate term limits so that the incumbent president could stand for re-election in elections which were not democratically run, in which the result was determined in advance. And in Burkina Faso, that didn't stand. It's the only African, sub-Saharan African country that's had a kind of Arab Spring in which the people turned out in front of parliament to prevent them from continuing to amend the constitution again to keep the incumbent in power. And in Uganda, there really is a dilemma because no one knows how this regime is going to end. They now have a president who's been in power since 1986 and has no intention of leaving, in the sense that all the institutions are sort of cramped and paralyzed because he exercises so much influence. So I think this gives us an opportunity to have a dialogue of one thing that went right. We actually did, in the end, have checks and balances that prevented a leader who wanted to stay in power from being able to do so. And our constitution did work and our electoral system did prevail. But I think we also see how close we came to sharing the experience of those countries in which the leader was interested in and tried to manipulate the system in order to stay in power, and that the threats to democracy are ever present in all of our countries, and that we need to be vigilant and perhaps learn from each other about what are the fundamental institutions that are necessary for rule of law, and what are the ways we need to work together, both in government and with civil society, to see the disadvantages of one-man rule and be sure that we're not headed down that path.
Yeah, I was divided in my thinking about this, whether I wanted to really respond more in the case of Algeria, where people are now back out in the street and testing the system. or in Afghanistan, but maybe Afghanistan's better known. And you know what you have there? You've got a system that in many ways is corrupt, and a system, of course, trying to do democracy in the middle of a war is tough. But at the same time, you see people with an enormous desire to vote and willing to take real risks. And there is no third way. If they don't settle things at the ballot box, they're going to end up settling them with bullets. And so, given the problems of our own society, I think I would be using our example to say, look, we came a little close here. But in the end, people's devotion to the system, to carrying out their duties, helped us pull through. And there's a lesson for you there if you choose choose to learn it. But it would be a more difficult conversation now because people who don't want to do it the way we suggest would be happier to just point fingers than to move. Larry, I don't know if you want to get into this or want to take us on to the next one.
Just a quick story. And my first posting was the Philippines during the Marcos regime. And I guess the kind of the missed opportunity there was it goes to the corruption issue in the sense that I think, we obviously were very close to Marcos. At the same time, we were trying to get him to, have better human rights policies and a lot less corruption. In the end, it was corruption that actually brought him down. So it was we couldn't convince him of that. He personally was not a corrupt man. His wife was extremely corrupt. And he was interested in power, not money. If he had, if we'd been able to persuade him that corruption actually was going to be his Achilles heel, but this was going to bring him down in the end, who knows what could have happened. But that's not the way history worked out, and he of course fell 10 years later.
We've got a question from Ron Neumann, who's a history professor at Texas Tech. He didn't put it in his question, but I happen to know that he also shares with me the fact that he was an infantry OCS graduate and spent some time in Vietnam. And his question is, how much damage has been done by our government's handling or mishandling of the 2020 election? Will we be able to restore our standing in developing countries regarding how we advise election protocol? And it's very related to the last question, which is why I wanted to bring it in at this point, but to carry on this discussion of relating what happens internally to what we do outside. And are we damaged? Let me keep it fairly simple. Are we damaged in any long-term way? And Harry, you want to, shall I cycle back in the same order? I don't know if this is fair.
Well, thank you. Clearly, it did not help. Social media, you can't hide things. The whole world saw what happened right after the election, saw that January 6th inexcusable insurrection. But at the same time, they did see that our institutions held and how important it is to have strong institutions run by corrupt, free people of both parties who were determined to have a transfer of power. Now, the people who do not want democracy are going to continue to make a mockery of that. We understand that. But as Ambassador Newman said, in every country I have lived, people thirst for democracy. It may not be the American style, but they want democracy. They want to choose their leaders. So our ability to help civil society, help parties set up is something that we need to invest in, as we have done before to help us. It won't stop mockery, but people aren't stupid. They aren't stupid. They know what's going on in countries. And we shouldn't hide the fact of what happened. We should explain it, but then also pivot to how we're going to help other nations as we clean up our act at home.
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, I think it's not an all bad story because at the end, a lot of people did their duty, and that's people, Republican election officials, judges that were appointed by Trump. It wasn't just control of the system by the other party. And people said this is the obligation under law. And that's actually, a pretty good story, despite having been tested and pushed pretty close to the brink. But Jimmy?
Yeah, I agree exactly. I think Harry and Ron, you've really hit the nail on the head. But I'd add one little spin to that, that we've been accused, and often appropriately, that when we talk about democracy overseas, it's a bit preachy and as though we've solved this problem and we know how to do this and you need to raise yourself up to our standard. I think now if we can take a different approach and say, this is a threat everywhere, and we've gone through this and we've learned some lessons. And here are some lessons about what enables a democracy to survive threats and to survive autocrats, or to survive people who don't want the system to work as it was designed. I think that it gives us a chance for a dialogue and to be able to look in a more granular way at some of the systems that we're advocating for, that other countries are trying to work through and see the advantages and the challenges of. So let's hope we can use it to our advantage in that way. But there's no question that we are damaged by this. This is not the reputation or the image that the U.S. wants to project.
Larry?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Well, I've got one here that certainly we could all have a lot of fun with. We're going to have to control ourselves on this one. And the question is, what do you think has been the biggest diplomatic failure as well as the diplomatic success in the last decade? And I'll give everybody a minute or two to think about that. I'm going to start with a different order. Start with Larry and go back to Jimmy, and give Harry a little more time to think this time before we flip the question on him. So, and I know for biggest diplomatic failures, we've got some choices here, but biggest success as well, and it's bounded by the last decade, so not forever.
Yeah. I'll just give two very personal ones, just on the trade and the economic side. I think the biggest failure that we've had in the last 10 years is the withdrawal from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Since that was the principal way that we were dealing with well, at least one of the ways we were dealing with the China conflict, and the ability to work with allies and people who share our views on how trading systems would work, were lined up, including developing countries as well as developed. And so that was that hurt us quite a bit. Greatest success in 10 years. That may be really egotistical here and just pick one actually that was slightly more than 10 years ago, but it was one of the few things I think that we did well in the Iraqi situation, which was when we took over Iraq, Saddam Hussein had borrowed incredible amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, mostly to prosecute the war with Iran, but also for other nefarious purposes. We, of course, were saddled with that debt when we took over the occupation. We had to figure out a way to get all the creditors, including France, China, Russia, and others, to essentially forgive most of that debt. And you can imagine most of those countries were not interested in forgiving that debt. They wanted to be repaid. So I was the lead negotiator for the debt restructuring, and we did. It took about 2 to 3 years to negotiate that, including bringing Jim Baker back and flying all around in the Air Force One to talk behind the scenes to get people to agree, and and all the way up to the president to lobby for it. But in the end, we were able to do that negotiation. So. Didn't get much attention around the world, but saved U.S. taxpayers a bunch of money.
Ambassador Culker.
All right. Well, I actually am glad Ambassador Greenwood mentioned TPP. I think it was a big missed opportunity, and do that. And another area that's not my specialty, it does seem to me that our emphasis on regime change more than 10 years ago in Iraq, but more recently in Libya and Syria, probably were not good diplomatic efforts. And I'm going to, a failure in the public health area, we wanted to lower our footprint in China. And when I left office in the HHS in the end of the Obama administration, we had 43 CDC employees co-located on the campus of the Chinese CDC. We had 3 bilateral agreements that were about information sharing. And as many people know, a country like China, if you're a bureaucrat or you're a technical person, you can't just choose to share information with the United States. You have to cite some authority that you can, that this is information which is you're authorized to share and you're the person authorized to share it. We allowed all 3, during the Trump administration, we allowed all 3 of those agreements to expire prior to the COVID outbreak. We reduced our CDC presence from 43 to 14. We moved them into the embassy compound as a post-Benghazi measure. They were no longer sharing water coolers with the Chinese CDC. And we, when we evacuated the people from China, we evacuated our entire staff from National Institutes of Health and Food and Drug Administration, even though they were the ones who were going to be able to get, for instance, PPE approved for export from China to the United States. So in the health area, I think our relations with China really hurt us. I'm happy to say that in the health area, I think we've also had some successes. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief is one of the best things we've ever done. And it was the right thing to do. We sustained it. We've done it for years. We are recognized as the essential partner in the fight against AIDS in Africa and throughout the world. And even our response to Ebola, it took us a while, but US leadership was necessary to reverse that and keep it from spreading even farther. So we do some things right, but not everything.
Well, you know, Winston Churchill said you can always trust the Americans to make the right decision after they've tried everything else. Harry, over to you.
Failure is our inability to get governments to hold free and fair elections around the world, despite massive investment and understanding the limits of our power. And how do we deal with autocrats that sometimes we have to balance power, balance our relations. We've seen that in Burma or Myanmar with Aung San Suu Kyi. We are seeing it now with the Ethiopian president who won the Nobel Prize, prosecuting a war that many innocents are dying, and they're not going to give up because they would be killed. So those, the limits, but that doesn't mean we should give up. The success, I like to go very micro. During my tenure in the Philippines, working with USAID, we were able to provide medicines to women who were dying from postpartum bleeding. Over 4,000 women were dying a year. And the US government partnered with an American pharmaceutical to ensure that poor women were able to get the shots and drips that their wealthier counterparts were able to get it. And we saved 4,000 plus lives, but they were also positively impacting their children. But that was a public-private partnership led by USAID and the embassy to save lives, and we're very proud of that.
I think I'm going to reflect on one thing which to me is an underlying problem in American foreign policy and diplomacy, and that is that we have difficulty sticking with the hard problems. And we've done marvelously well at sticking with something like NATO, with the institutional structures post-World War II. But with Afghanistan, within Iraq, with Syria, we have a tendency to flounder around in policy. And that's not just the Trump administration. When I'm talking about Afghanistan, I personally count 9. We're now on maybe the 10th policy we've had in Afghanistan. So problem isn't so much that we can't do it in 20 years, we can't do it for 2 years without changing our mind and changing our focus. And one could say that about Syrian policy from Obama through Trump. So we have a problem of wanting quick solutions to problems that don't have quick solutions. And then when we don't get quick solutions, we want to change the policy again. That's an intellectual problem, but it's one that I don't know that we address sufficiently in our academic studies to, to think about it. On success, there have been some successes, and I will give the Trump administration credit for the agreements with Israel, so-called Abraham agreements. Uh, they could be a little overhyped because none of the four countries that have signed them were actually ever at war with Israel or likely to be so. And you can question whether we paid a price that was correct. But the fact is, it is changing the relationship of Israel with a group of important Middle Eastern countries. And that landscape is not going to go back. Now, it does not solve the Israeli Palestinian problem. That festering sore remains, but it changes things around it. And I think one has to give credit to it. I want to try to get to a couple of questions that I know are from students or about students. One question says, our students are very interested in international affairs, including working in international careers. And it simply asks at present, what are the prospects for foreign service employment or in other careers? And I can tell you in the foreign service, but maybe we'll break this up in a little different pieces. In the foreign service, where you still entry by exam, the numbers seem to be up of those who wish to take the exam. And there's a lot of discussion about expansion, but we'll have to see what the administration actually puts forth and what the Congress is prepared to fund. But as some of my colleagues have pointed out in earlier discussions, there are a lot of other places that you can also go into international affairs. Did just of the State Department, there is also the civil service, which is domestically based, doesn't go overseas as much. But there are a variety of other areas of public service that you can go into. And I thought maybe, Jimmy, you could talk about the health area a bit. And then maybe I could ask Ambassador Thomas to talk a bit about NGOs in the voluntary world. And Larry, maybe you can talk about some of the other aspects like trade negotiations and things where there are government careers that are in foreign relations. So, Jimmy.
Sure. If we were having this conversation 20 years ago, I would have said, absolutely, people who have degrees in even political science, but certainly in public health, a master's degree, their jobs in NGOs, you can implement USAID financed programs. This is a great opportunity. That paradigm has changed dramatically. There are now a critical mass of people, many thanks to programs like Texas Tech and every other university have, of training international students. And so every low and middle income country now has a critical mass of skilled people who can implement basic health programs and provide basic services, help write a grant, do some monitoring and evaluation. I think the careers are for the experts. We now need a degree of expertise in global health, which is very valuable in informing those programs, bringing programs around the world to first world standards, being able to translate the experience we have in the US and the knowledge we have to research universities in Africa, to programs in Asia that are actually trying to bring higher quality urban health programs, aging programs, kinds of problems that low and middle income countries haven't necessarily had, non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases. So the sense of opportunity in global health is still very present. It still is multidisciplinary. You do not have to be an MD to be involved. A lot of program management and kind of liberal arts, social science backgrounds are still relevant, but you do have to have a higher level of expertise. It's rare that you would go as a first job to do an international health program these days.
Very interesting. Harry.
Yes, I think Jimmy spoke about that very comprehensively. I would say, though, A lot of youngsters that I teach are more excited about going to work for an NGO than the State Department. They think it's decentralized, that they will be able to make a difference. And in many cases, they are able to. But they actually, as Jimmy said, often are working with USAID funding as an implementing partner. And some of them choose to join us. I think what we really continue to need to look at are civil society programs. As I said earlier, these democracy attempts have failed. So how can we strengthen those and bring young Americans to work for them? Uh, because in the other fields, you're going to need to be an expert. In Zimbabwe, believe it or not, we had an American professor of mining from Penn State who was brought to help the Zimbabweans work on their nickel mines. One of the things they had not exploited, and that was for batteries, which is going to be, to me, one of the transformational things of the future. And what he did, because there weren't local experts, he brought a bunch of students from Penn State to work there. We also, shortage of doctors, all the Zimbabwean doctors are going to South Africa. So American medical school doctors, after they graduate, before they begin their internship, residences come there for 6 months to a year. So there are a lot of opportunities, and they're not as long-term as they used to be. But I think that's where we can see some of our kids make a difference. But I think long-term, foreign service, foreign commercial service, USAID, or foreign agricultural service has many more opportunities.
Larry?
Yeah,
Treat.
I think that there's a huge need for people with tech background in the State Department, as well as other foreign policy positions in Washington, D.C., because tech is becoming the centerpiece of a lot of our trade negotiations and our trade issues, particularly the ones with China, but not just with China. So obviously people who can talk fluently about AI, 5G, IoT, those are the issues that are going to be at the center of a lot of our trade disputes moving in the next 5 to 10 years. So we need those kind of people. And it's interesting, when I was working with the embassy in Tokyo, when I was working with MetLife, that there are a lot more younger foreign service officers with that technical background who have been at startup companies and have then gone into the State Department after doing startup work. So I think that's great, and I hope we can get more of those. But as you pointed out, there's also lots of other opportunities for jobs in the international or foreign affairs area, other than the government. I would certainly encourage anybody who's interested in economic development to look at the Asian Development Bank, because frankly, we were hungry, still are, for Americans to go to the Philippines to work at ADB. There's a kind of informal quota system, as there is in the United Nations, by nationality, and we're always looking for more Americans to go to ADB. So if you got a master's in economic development, or even better, a PhD, you definitely look at the Asian Development Bank for a job, because it's a great organization. The other thing is looking at private companies, to do government relations work in a private company. Almost all the MNCs have very large government relations departments. It can be fun work. Not quite as satisfying, I should say, as working for the State Department and feeling like you're working really for the U.S. interests, but a lot more financially rewarding. So you can have that trade-off, or do like I did and do both in your careers. So there's lots of opportunities, and then the nonprofit area is also a great place for people with international background. Conservation work, climate work, of course, is critical. A lot of that work is being done at NGOs.
I have one here from Ambassador Culker, from somebody from Nicholas Berchfeld, who said he was a graduate intern for you when you were at Health and Human Services. And his question is, what do you think Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala will be able to achieve in the WTO? Do you see the organization continuing to play a role in global trade, or will something new emerge?
Well, Nick, great to hear from you. And since I know only one person in Lubbock who's a Texas Tech graduate and a great global health person, I glad he seized my invitation to attend tonight. He's somebody I hope that can help continue this conversation in Lubbock after this session is over. I think it's great that the U.S. has agreed to have Ngozi as the head of WTO. We had resisted her nomination, which had to be by consensus up to now. And the organization, as Ambassador Greenwood knows better than I do, and eager to hear him talk to it, is in a difficult time. I mean, the trade, we've seen trade as a transactional relationship rather than one that is where you build trust and where the rules can benefit everyone. If each trade deal has clear winners and losers, the system that the WTO was trying to institute is going to be hard put to survive or to be seen as in US or other countries' benefit. I'll just say, just the minor point on the health side, that if the vaccine distribution, which we talked about earlier, doesn't work, there are under the WTO a so-called TRIPS agreement about trade in intellectual property, which allows any country to declare a health emergency and require the manufacturer of for instance, a vaccine to manufacture that, to give a license to a local manufacturer, to even say an Indian manufacturer, to deal with a local market for the exclusive use of that country at a negotiated price, but the responsibility is on the manufacturer to reach that compulsory license. And so the trade rules as they're now in effect are could result in even more chaos than we have in the vaccine distribution and equity allocation than we're seeing now, because countries could exercise some rights under WTO. And I think that Nigeria is one of the countries that's looking to try to promote that. So having a Nigerian as the head of WTO has certainly brought that issue higher on the agenda, I think, of many low and middle income countries that don't have their own research and development capability, but do have some manufacturing capacity.
Larry, this is very much a question in your bailiwick as well.
Right. You know, I've had the privilege of actually working with Madame Ngozi when she was the Minister of Finance in Nigeria, and we were doing restructuring of her debt. And you know, there was some who opposed her because they were afraid that she wouldn't be able to stand up to Chinese pressure. Those people don't know Madame Ngozi. I mean, she is one tough lady, and she being Minister of Finance in Nigeria is not an easy job, as Harry knows. And she doesn't crumble under any pressure. She's incredible. So she'll be a great leader, and I'm really pleased. Obviously, you can tell by talking about her that I'm pleased that she got the job. But it's going to be a very difficult job. It's a huge challenge, and the first issue she's going to have to deal with is the reform of the. I won't get too technical here, but there's a dispute settlement mechanism that has kind of fallen into disrepair. It does need reform, and so the U.S. is one of the main complainers about it, and she's going to need to find a way to get us to the table, which I think the Biden administration is willing to do, and start talking about how those reforms are going to be worked out. The other set of reforms, of course, are how we cover more types of practices, such as the practices of state-owned enterprises, so that they can come under the disciplines of the WTO. They currently are not, and some people think that gives China and other countries a freedom to do things that aren't fair. But I think one of the opportunities might be interesting to see is that also to do a new trade deal that does revolve around COVID and PPE, ventilators, where we do a tariff-free regime for all medical related equipment. So that's something that some people are talking about. The other thing they're talking about is a digital deal where there's new rules on digital trade, and to go to the question of data privacy, data transfer, and those kinds of issues. So there's lots on the table, but we've got a great leader in Madame Ngozi.
Thank you. We're getting quite a few questions, some of them pulling a little different directions, about climate change. Now, I don't know that any of us are really experts there, although I don't know exactly what special wisdom some of my colleagues may have hidden from me. But let me try to blend a couple of these together and let you have a whack at them in whatever pieces you'd like. One part is a question that says, you know, how much has the problem of COVID and the world's reaction to it, has that set us back in the general struggle? With another related question quotes Forbes article saying that America is already cutting so much carbon it doesn't need the Paris Climate Agreement. And so there's several questions. How much do we need the climate agreement as opposed to actually doing something about climate? How much are we prepared to cooperate with other countries in sharing technologies? And I don't want to spend the whole rest of our very limited time on climate, but let me ask my colleagues to take any part of that they would like to at the sort of free start. And before I put the mic on anybody, is there anybody who'd like to start?
Well, I worked on climate at the Asian Development Bank, so I'll just give a little bit of perspective from that, if it's okay. I guess to the first question, it's true, of course, that the U.S. has had declining carbon emissions, but that's not, frankly, enough to given the size of the amount that we have to be able to keep the temperature under the 2% increase. So clearly there needs to be more, and Paris was never meant to be the final step. That was only the initial step. So we're going to have more ambitious targets than the ones that we made in Paris, and which are the ones that are being, the trend we have now is good but not sufficient. And so we're going to need more, clearly. On the technology and financing side, that's a big issue. You know, the degree to which we're going to help finance both the help to help developing countries both reduce their carbon footprint as well as take mitigation measures against what will be inevitable climate change, which are kind of the two parts of the climate financing package is going to be important. And I think the Biden administration is going to need to make a strong argument that we need to ante up and put in an ambitious package there of financing to help developing countries do that.
Jimmy, do you want to talk about?
When the word COVID comes in, I know I'm going to be on the spot to answer the question.
There's no escaping.
Right. I think we don't know yet. It's true that COVID in some ways has set us back because international cooperation and kind of engagement has become secondary to solving our own internal problems and taking care of our own needs. But actually, because air travel, cruise travel, auto commuting have all also been cut back dramatically, the US made much more progress towards some of the carbon reduction goals than we would have any other way. It seems as though that's unlikely to be sustainable, and which parts of those reductions are likely to continue into the future beyond COVID, whether COVID has taught us some lessons that we can adapt our own lifestyles to maybe be a little bit more environmentally friendly is important. But the idea that these unexpected once in a lifetime or once in a century events are now likely to happen, I think I'm surprised at the question from Texas. I mean, the past couple of weeks in Texas, I think, have shown us that our infrastructure really isn't prepared to deal with the kinds of setbacks that unexpected climate developments or unexpected health developments are imposing on the United States, even though we're probably the best prepared country for some of those in the world, and we're being caught flat-footed, and we're realizing that our infrastructure and our systems aren't well enough prepared. So I hope that it's a sobering moment, realizing that the threat's not going to go away and that some of our adaptations are working, but that maybe they're not working well enough or soon enough.
Harry, would you like to comment on this?
Just a little bit. we clearly know we're going to see more weather extremes. But what we've seen in Africa is where population is exploding. How does Africa feed itself? We see that planting seasons have changed because the rainy season comes at a different time than farmers always expected. We, the United States, provide some of them with mobile phones and where we can help them with weather patterns, but that's frankly a drop in the bucket. So that is important because if we aren't able to help Africa feed themselves, if they are continuing suffering from the more droughts, more hot seasons, then we're going to have instability. And that instability will come not just to Africa, but to our shores. So we have to look at that also.
Now, when you think of how much instability promoting population movement we have right now between the Syria war, but Lebanon populations moving out of Africa, trying to come through Libya, hitting Europe, populations moving particularly from Afghanistan through Turkey. If you add major climate disasters and additional major population moves on top of that, you could be looking at something pretty horrifying. And I can imagine how some people think this is just Europe's problem because they can walk there and they have to swim to get here. But I don't think that's going to work as an organizing philosophy. So we will go on.
Well, someone commented in an earlier discussion we had today about the destruction of the rainforest, and that in terms of zoonotic infections of animal to human transmission, we are living closer to species that we have not lived close to before, and the bat origins of both Ebola and of COVID are in part a result of environmental changes that man-made environmental changes. So we need to be alert to that as well.
It's harder and harder to only be a foreign policy person these days. But I guess the other good news is for students and for others that there's room for a lot of different interests in this world of foreign policy because we don't live alone anymore. We had a question, but it's one more pandemic question, but it asked how were we and the world unprepared for a pandemic, COVID-19? But Jimmy, you kind of talked about that with the withdrawal of people from the world. Maybe I can reframe that question a little bit, and that is to build off your last answer. Where would you put the focus now in international cooperation on starting to think about and prepare for the next pandemic, even as we deal with this one?
Yeah, I think the good news is that we actually have some of the infrastructure in place. There's the only binding international health agreement are called the International Health Regulations. They're from 2005, and they say what countries need to do to prepare for outbreaks, to communicate about them, share information, and so on. Majority of countries in the world are not observing these. The only control of them is self-reporting, which we know is inadequate. And so there is a move, part of the reform of the World Health Organization is how to modernize these international health regulations and bring them into the decade now that we know what a real outbreak looks like and what the failures were in terms of identification, communications, access, questions to be answered. And so WHO does need more authority, like maybe the International Atomic Energy Agency has, to do on-demand inspections and to have independent ability to look at outbreaks in places like China where they did not have full access in the past. I think we also, just in terms of, the threat over the past couple decades since 9/11, terrorism has killed in the low tens of thousands of people around the world, about 95% of them in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The epidemics are eerily similar. There have been about the same level of magnitude of people dying from epidemics, and 95% of them have been outside of the United States and Europe. And but we are spending 10 times more on preventing, intelligence about analyzing airport security, community security, institutional preparedness, law enforcement, everything about terrorism than we're spending about outbreaks and epidemics. And it does seem to me that we have to move it into the category that whereas people thought an outbreak was like an asteroid, that we didn't really have to, it might come, but we didn't have to change our daily lives or invest much in preventing it. We now realize that epidemics are with us and that we're going to have to ante up and spend the money that's necessary to be able to prevent them, detect them, and respond to them.
Thank you. We are drawing near to the witching hour here. So I thought I would just ask each of my colleagues to take a couple of minutes and say, what would you like to say to students out in Texas about why international relations are important or why they might want to care? You don't have to cover the whole area, but think about, what would you like to leave them with from our discussion? That's pretty open-ended. Does anybody want particularly? I'm going to take advantage of my own question, and that gives all my colleagues time to think. And that is to simply reflect about the 37 years I spent in the Foreign Service. And there were plenty of nights that I went home and I was not happy with how a decision came out. There was bureaucracy, there were other things. But in that 37 years, I never went home one night and asked myself whether I was working on something that mattered. And that's, I think, a source of considerable comfort. Particularly, there are people who think that real life is what goes on between the time they quit work and when they go to bed. And I have to tell you, as you get older, these things close in on each other. You work longer and you go to bed earlier. So it's important to find satisfaction in whatever you do. I personally found a lot in this international relations in the Foreign Service, but there are plenty of other places to find it. And Larry, a thought?
Well, I'll just take a very, again, economic point of view on this, which is that we're 300 million people out of a world of 7 billion people. The rest of the world is actually growing faster than we are, which makes sense since they're poorer than us generally. And that's so our economic prosperity, our future very much depends on our connections to the world. And so making sure those connections are strong and healthy and that we're benefiting from them is such a critical part of our future that, and I think would be exciting for students to be part of that. It's what the State Department does. That's what the policy and environment, the whole ecology that exists in Washington, D.C. does. That's what business does. And so again, I will encourage people to study their economics and get into the international economic policy arena, because it's really important.
Jimmy?
Yeah, when I heard the list of co-sponsors of this Ambassadors Day and this session this evening, I was really encouraged because, as you know, one of the topics I like to give talks on is how to prepare for jobs that don't exist yet. And it seems like you have the kind of interdisciplinary approach in which no matter what you do, what you're studying or what your profession is, you're going to live an international life. And that doesn't mean just taking an international trip once in a while, but appreciating the diversity and the importance of the way the world works on everything we're doing, whether you're working in Lubbock or you're working in Washington or wherever you end up, that we are interdependent and that what happens overseas affects us. What we do has an impact around the world, and that the sense of understanding why the world works the way it does is something that we can take advantage of no matter what we're doing. And it's great to see that Texas Tech is part of the solution on that.
And Carrie, that gives you the last word.
Well, thank you. I encourage the Texas Tech students to join the Foreign Service, to join USAID. You have the skills and the ability. We need new and innovative solutions to human trafficking, to gay rights, to pandemics, to trade, to everything that we discussed tonight. And we think you all have the capability and a new way of looking at things. I could not have imagined the changes that I saw. And I will say this, despite the challenges we face and we face in our nation, there was no greater honor than representing our country abroad. So please consider it.
Well, we have not touched every question, and I apologize for that, but we are approaching the witching hour, I think. Dr. Misra, would you like to take us home?
Yes, and first, our sincere thanks to the panelists, our ambassadors, for giving us their time and an opportunity to engage with them in such a rich dialogue. It's an honor to be with you, ambassadors. And also at the same time, I want to thank our attendees for their participation and engagement. As Ambassador Newman said, there were some wonderful questions, but we were unable to respond to all of your questions simply because of time constraint, and we're sorry for that. Before we conclude, I don't see an applause button. But I want all of us, we applaud you, the ambassadors, for your participation and for your time. I know all my colleagues join me in applauding your engagement with us. Before we conclude, I want all of you to know that we do plan to bring back the Ambassadors Forum to Lubbock for a face-to-face interaction next year. Stay tuned.
We'll be looking forward to it. And I also want to note my thanks to Joan Williamson for all the help as we have organized this over months, and to Maria Rosales, my own staff, and to your technical staff that have obviously done a marvelous job, because nothing has gone wrong.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.